Chapter 1. When Things Were Simpler. This is a story about a time when things were simpler, before the turn of the century, when the world could still be measured in miles ridden, promises kept, and bullets counted. A time when a man's word mattered because it was often the only thing he truly owned. There were no endless committees, no distant authorities hiding behind paperwork. Out on the frontier, justice traveled at the speed of a horse, and the law was carried alone by the few willing to enforce it. This story belongs to one of those men. The train came out of the dark like a long iron serpent, its headlamp carving a white scar across the prairie. Smoke and steam rolled back over the cars in thick ropes, wheels hammering the rails with a rhythm that carried for miles in the still night air. Martello and Calhoun rode parallel to the track, two dark shapes against the starlit grass. Albino warrior moved beneath Martello with tireless gait of a horse that had learned long ago that distance was just another enemy to wear down. The stallion's white coat caught the stray glints of the headlamp and threw them back like a pale ghost. "They're running heavy," Calhoun called over the thunder. Too heavy for regular freight this time of night. Martello kept his one good eye narrowed against the wind, the old Civil War scar pulling tight across the empty socket on the other side of his face. "They know we are coming," he said. Calhoun gave a short, humorless laugh. "They always do when you're riding. The question is whether they care." A rifle cracked from the roof of a boxcar. The bullet sang past Martello's head. He did not flinch. Another shot followed. Martello drew one of the matched revolvers without hurry and returned fire. A shape on the roof jerked and dropped flat. "Night shaders," Calhoun muttered, "or men running for them." The name hung in the air like smoke. The night shaders had been little more than whispers until recently. Freight that had moved when it shouldn't. Quiet riders who spoke too little and are paid too well. Small deliberate marks left behind. A black cloth on a lantern, a particular knot on a rope, or a single playing card face down. Nothing loud, just enough for a man like Martello to know the work was theirs. They closed the distance as the train slowed for a grade. Martello stood in the stirrups and swung himself onto the ladder of a moving car. His boots found the rungs, and albino warrior veered away on his own. The wind tore at his coat as he climbed. The shotgunner waiting at the top spoke in a low, rough voice. "You should have stayed in Sawtooth, Marshal. Some loads ain't for the law to be touched." Martello raised the revolver and fired. The man spun and went down. Moments later, the train shuddered to a halt and a shower of sparks. Martello dropped to the gravel. Calhoun rode up, rifle across his saddle. "3 down," Calhoun reported. "2 more ran into the brush. They left most of the cargo." Martello nodded. He pulled a playing card from beneath a latched crate. "King of spades." The small jagged mark on the back unmistakable. He slipped it into his coat pocket. Martello did not see the law as something confined to ink and parchment. To him, it was a burden carried by the individual willing to stand beneath order and chaos, when no one else would. Justice, in his world, was rarely neat or sentimental. It was decided by whether order had been restored and whether the innocent were still alive. Sometimes the cost of that order fell squarely on the shoulders of the man wearing the badge. He was not a man who reached for his gun lightly. The frontier had carved patience into him that time could not wear away. The West taught a man quickly that rushing a moment often meant losing it. So he waited when others would have acted, watched when others would have spoken, and let trouble reveal its true shape before he stepped into it. Mercy still existed in his world, but it had boundaries. A man who had stumbled could be corrected. A mistake could be walked back. But once someone knowingly chose violence or corruption, once profit or power mattered more than the lives endangered, the moment for negotiation had passed. To him, it became a question of balance, restoring what had been broken before the damage spread further. His guiding belief never had changed. No matter how the world shifted, Martello could be quoted saying, "The law is only real if someone is willing to enforce it alone." Calhoun dismounted and stood beside him. Eyes stopped on the train. "That belief has carved you quite a reputation. Men who should fear you are already gone by the time you ride in." Martello gave a small grunt. Over the years, that reputation had traveled ahead of him like distant thunder. By the time he rode into most towns, many of the men who had reason to fear him had already disappeared into the hills. His name passed quietly among saloon tables and through backroom conversations long before he even stepped through a door. Some tested it anyway. Most chose the wiser path. Those decades on the frontier had filled his life with allies and enemies, though the land had a habit of thinning both lists with equal efficiency. Few men had lived long enough to become legends, and to that truth Martello had buried more companions than he cared to remember. Grave markers scattered across the territories told their own quiet stories. They reminded him that the law was rarely carried by a single man for long. Yet Martello was still riding, and as long as he rode, the work was never finished. He ran a gloved hand along Albino's neck, feeling the stallion's steady breath. The horse stood calm despite the recent gunfire, white coat faintly luminous under the stars. Calhoun glanced at the stallion. You never did tell me the full story of how you got him. Martello was quiet for a moment. Long before Sawtooth ever heard my name, I rode the harsh spaces where the frontier still answered to more rifles than to law. Calhoun waited. It was during those final bitter years of the frontier wars, Martello said. I crossed paths with Chief Dakota Winters of the Wapiti tribe. He was the kind of war leader cavalry officers were trained to fight. He didn't stand in open battle or charge headlong into gunfire. He studied his enemies the way a hunter studies tracks in the snow. Columns sent to capture him came back with nothing but tired horses and stories of how he was always somewhere else by the time they had arrived. Most soldiers saw him reach for the rifles first. Martello's hand paused on the horse's shoulder. I did something different. Their first meeting happened in a narrow canyon where both men realized, almost too late, that neither had arrived alone. Tension filled the air thick enough to taste. Hands hovered near weapons, and for several long seconds it seemed certain the canyon would echo with gunfire before the sun finished its crossing. But neither man fired. Something passed between them in that moment. Not trust, not friendship, but recognition. Both understood the cost of the ground they stood on. Both understood that man behind them expected blood. They parted that day without words. Their second meeting came months later, under circumstances neither had planned. Once again, the distance between violence and restraint was measured in seconds. This time, the silence held longer. Weapons stayed holstered. What began as caution slowly turned into something rare on that frontier. Respect. Over time, through brief encounters and tense conversations, carried across campfires and empty stretches of land, Martello and Dakota Winters came to realize the same burden in each other. Both were leaders forced to carry decisions that cost lives. Both understood that war had a way of grinding men down until only the strongest convictions remained. They were never allies, but they were no longer enemies either. When the fighting finally burned itself out and the frontier wars faded into uneasy peace, Dakota Winters sought Martello out once more. There was no escort, no soldiers, no warriors standing guard. Just the chief, the wind across the plains, and the horse he led by the reins. A stallion unlike anything most men had ever seen, Martello said quietly. An albino with a coat as white as winter frost and pale blue eyes that seemed to hold the sky itself. The animal moved with the quiet strength of something that had survived too many battles to fear another. It was a horse few men could approach, and even fewer could ride. He ran his hand along the jagged scar along the horse's flank. It carried its own history written across its body. An old arrow scar along the shoulder, ribs that had once shone through the skin during a brutal winter when food ran scarce, and this lightning-shaped mark from a fall down a canyon wall that should have killed it. Calhoun let out a slow breath. And he just gave it to you? Martello nodded once. Dakota Winters placed the reins in my hands and spoke only once. A warrior should ride something that refuses to fear death. I accepted it without ceremony. Men like us didn't waste words on gratitude we both already understood. He looked at the stallion. I never sold him, never traded him, never replaced him. Named him Albino Warrior. In a world where loyalty shattered under pressure and promises broke easier than dry branches, he became one of the few things in my life that never betrayed me. Calhoun leaned against his saddle, watching him. You've carried that weight a long time. Few men lived long enough to become legends, and to that truth Martello had buried more companions than he cared to remember. Grave markers scattered across the territories told their own quiet stories. They reminded him that the law was rarely carried by a single man for long. Yet Martello was still riding, and as long as he rode, the work was never finished. For most of the life, his enemies had been easy to recognize. Men with dust on their coats and revolvers on their hips. They robbed trains or ran contraband. They took what they wanted with violence and intimidation. But as the West changed, Martello had begun to realize something far more troubling. Not all enemies wore outlaw colors anymore. Railroads carved through the land, and the towns sprouting along their tracks grew faster than the law could keep up. Politics and commerce were beginning to twist justice in ways that a lone rider could not easily confront. Increasingly, as he aged along with the land, Martello found himself standing across the table not from bandits, but from bureaucrats and officials who valued stability over truth. To them, he was a destabilizing force, almost a relic of a harsher but simpler time. Martello understood something they did not. Orders built on convenience do not last. When the law begins bending to power, someone must decide whether to follow the rules or enforce what the rules were meant to protect. For better or worse, Martello had spent his entire life making that decision. He cut a striking figure even before a man even noticed the badge. Long hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. The sides of his head shaved close in a severe style that made his weathered features stand out. Beneath a hard, set brow sat the scarred reminder of too many battlefields. One eye lost years earlier to sharp metal from a Civil War artillery blast. The other carried the quiet weight of a man who watched the worst of human nature unfold across the frontier. His beard was trimmed into a sharp goatee that framed his mouth like a blade. He carried a pair of custom revolvers in matched holsters. He kept them clean and balanced. His gun belt rode heavily along and low across his hips. The leather darkened and scarred from years of weather, dust, and long rides. Most lawmen wore their badge proudly on the breast of their coat. Martello never cared for that kind of display. Instead, he pinned his old Civil War badge to the band of his hat. To him, it was no decoration. It was a reminder earned through blood and survival, proof that victory and simply living through the fight were rarely the same thing. His black coat had long since surrendered to time. Elbows worn thin, shoulders faded by the dust and sun. Beneath it, he wore a simple vest, dressed like a man who expected to ride and knew he might not come back the same way he left. For most of his life, Martello rode the wide-open spaces between towns where the law arrived slowly and often even left slower. His reputation had grown across the territories the way dust travels on the wind. Quietly at first, then everywhere at once. By the time he reached his later years, there were very few places west of the Mississippi where men hadn't at least heard the name Martello. Some of them spoke with respect, others with unease, but almost no one dismissed the stories outright. Out on the frontier, a reputation did not survive long enough unless it had been earned. That reputation is what eventually brought him to the attention of the United States Marshal Service. Martello had never chased appointments or titles. For years, he had served where the work demanded, out-tracking fugitives across state lines, escorting prisoners through territory where the law had little more than a rumor for protection, and settling disputes that could have easily turned into bloodshed if handled by the wrong man. He was known among a handful of federal men who mattered as someone who finished what he started and asked for very little in return. Most importantly, he was known as a man who could not be bought. Calhoun had ridden beside him through most of it. They had first met during the war. The two young men quickly learned that survival depended on the man next to you more than the orders coming from behind. After the fighting ended, they kept riding together, not because either one asked the other to stay, but because neither one saw a reason to part ways. They shared long stretches of empty country, hard winters, and the kind of silences that only exist between men who have already said everything that needs saying. Trust between them had been earned the hard way, through blood, through bad decisions, and through the simple fact that each man knew the other would not leave when things turned ugly. When the position opened in the district that oversaw the region surrounding Sawtooth County, a handful of names were quietly passed along the desks in Washington and in regional offices farther west. Some were younger men with political backing. Others carried influence through the right families or party connections. Martello's name arrived through a different route. It came from men who had ridden beside him, men who had watched him work, men who knew the difference between a lawman who wore the badge and a lawman who carried it. There were no speeches and no ceremony when the decision was made. A letter arrived bearing the seal of the United States government and the authority that came with it. Martello accepted the appointment the same way he accepted most things in life, without much fanfare and without asking what it might cost him down the road. Calhoun came with him, not because he was ordered to, but because that's how it had always been between them. That decision eventually brought them both to Sawtooth County. They rode on through the dark, the stop train already miles behind them. The only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves and the occasional creak of leather. Calhoun rode alongside without speaking for a long while. Then he finally broke the silence. "You think that cargo was meant for Sawtooth?" Martello kept his eye on the horizon. Some of it. The rest was probably headed farther west. Either way, it wasn't the first time I've seen freight moving like that in this direction. At first glance, Sawtooth looked like dozens of other frontier towns scattered across the expanding west. It sat where several routes crossed, cattle drives coming down from the north, freight wagons pushing east through the rail lines, and prospectors drifting in search of whatever land might still be hiding. The town was bound to attract trouble sooner or later. But the rumors surrounding Sawtooth had been different. They didn't carry the usual stories of stagecoach robberies or drunken gunfighters. Instead, they moved quietly through the territory, passing in half-finished sentences and careful glances over their shoulders. Freight shipments that seemed heavier than their ledgers claimed, wagons arriving at night and leaving before sunrise, men who had never worked an honest trade suddenly walked around with more money than they could reasonably explain. The West was full of small secrets, and most towns survived by pretending not to see them. But Martello had ridden too many miles to mistake coincidence for pattern. Sawtooth County was growing faster than it should have been. Money flowed through it like water after a storm. And not all of it came from cattle or railroads. Somewhere inside that growth, something had taken root. Something quiet enough to stay hidden and profitable enough to keep the people involved very careful. Calhoun glanced over at him. "You think tonight was connected?" Martello didn't answer right away. He just adjusted the brim of his hat and kept riding. "I think we're about to find out." For a time, Martello and Calhoun focused on the ordinary work expected from a United States Marshal. Petty smugglers, cattle disputes, the occasional bandit foolish enough to believe Sawtooth was too remote for federal attention. But slowly the reports began to change. Small details appearing in the corners of conversations, unusual shipments passing through town with vague paperwork, rumors of a white powder moving across the region, something far more valuable than anything that came out of the surrounding mines. Money changing hand in places money rarely lingered. Martello had learned long ago that corruption rarely arrived with spectacle. It crept in quietly, slow, patient, and careful not to attract attention until it had already taken hold. One night, after a long, uneventful week, Martello and Calhoun sat at the far end of the saloon bar. The place was quiet, the usual low murmur of conversation drifting through the smoke. Calhoun nursed a glass and shook his head. "Been damn near peaceful around here lately," he said. "Almost makes a man nervous." Martello took a slow sip. "Don't get used to it." Behind the bar, Wise Whiskey set two fresh glasses in front of them. "Heard some of the freight boys talking earlier," he said casually. "Seems a few shipments coming through lately ain't matching their paperwork. Weights off, manifests are vague, same kind of thing I saw before the last time certain folks started getting comfortable." They were still sitting there when the boy from the telegraph office came in. He handed Calhoun a folded message. Calhoun read it twice, then folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. "Washington," he said quietly. They want me at the field office effective immediately. 2 days later, they stood on the platform at the small train station outside Sawtooth. The locomotive hissed and rumbled, ready to pull east. Calhoun had his saddlebag slung over one shoulder and his rifle in his scatterbutt. A day and a half if the weather holds, he said. Martello nodded. Watch your back out there. Calhoun gave a small, tired smile. You do the same here. He stepped forward and clasped Martello's forearm for a moment, the kind of grip that didn't need words, then climbed aboard. Martello stayed on the platform until the train pulled away and disappeared down the tracks. Jesse Morgan still wore a badge when Martello first began hearing his name. Not a federal badge, but a deputy star pinned proudly to his coat. Close enough for the law that most folks in Sawtooth County assumed he stood firmly on the right side of it. Morgan himself had built a reputable, respectable reputation in town. He was capable, quick-thinking, and carried a kind of easy charm that made people trust him faster than they probably should have. But beneath that confidence, there was something else about him. Something restless. Men who had spent enough time around trouble recognized it immediately. Morgan had the look of someone who believed the rules applied to him differently. Official complaints never mentioned him, but the rumors did. It was never anything direct. A freight clerk mentioned a deputy who seemed to be doing well for himself. A saloon conversation that died too quickly when Morgan walked through the door. A rancher remarking that Morgan seemed to travel far more than most deputies had reason to. Men like Morgan didn't appear in official reports, but they appeared everywhere else. Martello began watching him the way a tracker studies fresh signs along a trail. Quietly, patiently, without announcing the hunt. Morgan's movements didn't fit the pattern of a man simply keeping peace in Sawtooth County. He rode out more often than most deputies needed to. Sometimes south towards Kansas City, sometimes west along the railroads where freight passed through with minimal oversight, and everywhere he went he seemed to find company. Quiet exchanges in alleyways, short conversations that ended the moment strangers drifted too close, small packages changing hands with the kind of care men usually reserve for things they didn't want anyone noticing. Martello had seen that pattern before. It was the pattern of a man moving product. He did not rush the matter. Patience had carried him through far too many hunts to abandon it now. Instead, he built the case slowly, piece by piece. He watched Morgan's routes as he listened to the right people and ignored the wrong ones. Some men talked freely. Others spoke only after Martello assured them their names would never appear on a report. The trail grew cleaner with time. Then the afternoon came in Kansas City that removed the last of Martello's doubts. From across the street, he watched Morgan make 3 separate contacts in the span of an hour. Each meeting was brief. Each ended the same way, with a quick exchange of small wrapped parcels that disappeared just as quickly as they appeared. By the time the third transaction ended, Martello already knew what he was looking at. Narcotics. He crossed the street and approached openly, the way a lawman does when he already knows the outcome. Morgan turned as Martello reached him, offering that easy practice smile. Marshal, Morgan said, sounding surprised but not worried. Didn't expect to see you this far from Sawtooth. Martello studied him for a moment. What business brings a Sawtooth deputy all the way to Kansas City? Morgan gave a small shrug, still smiling. Looking at property, actually. Thought I might put some money into something out here. Prices are better than they used to be. Martello didn't respond right away. He just kept watching Morgan's face. Morgan tilted his head slightly. If you don't believe me, I could show you the place. It's not far from here. Nice little house on the edge of town. I was just heading over to take another look. Martello finally spoke again, his voice calm and even. Mind if I have a look in your coat first? Morgan's smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes shifted for half a second. He gave a short laugh, like the request was almost funny. Are you serious? I am. Morgan hesitated, then slowly opened his coat with one hand, still playing it casual. Go ahead. You won't find anything but a pocket watch and some tobacco. Martello reached in without breaking eye contact. His fingers brushed past the watch and found the small, lightly wrapped parcel tucked in the inner lining. He pulled it out and held it between them. Morgan's expression finally changed. The arrest itself was quiet and professional. No gun drawn, no crowd gathering in the street. Morgan was fined, arrested, money seized, and the narcotics logged into evidence exactly the way the federal procedure required. For most lawmen, that would have been the end of it. But Martello hadn't ridden on the frontier too long to believe in crimes like that happening alone. Men like Jesse Morgan were rarely the source of corruption. They were the doorway. And somewhere beyond that doorway, someone in Sawtooth County was making a great deal of money moving poison across the West. Martello intended to find out who. What he didn't know yet was that the trail he had just uncovered would not stop with a single deputy. Before it was over, it would threaten to tear across Sawtooth County itself and put Martello's badge, his reputation, and perhaps his life directly in the crosshairs. Martello's mind had been shaped by decades spent riding the wide spaces where the law arrived late and consequences fast. Years of tracking fugitives across rough country had sharpened his instincts to a razor's edge. He possessed an uncommon awareness of the world around him, the kind that allowed him to read a room before a word was spoken. A shift in posture, a hesitation in a handshake, the flicker of a man's eyes when the wrong question was asked. Those were things he noticed without thinking. Criminals often believed they could out-talk a lawman, but Martello had learned long ago that men revealed the truth in the spaces between their words. More often than not, he knew a lie before the liar had finished telling it. Unlike many who relied on force and reputation, Martello understood the value of patience. He was comfortable waiting, watching a situation unfold until the right moment presented itself. Time, he believed, was a weapon most men didn't know how to use. Outlaws expected confrontation. They expected a marshal to storm in and draw iron. Martello rarely gave them that satisfaction. Instead, he let men grow comfortable, let their confidence stretch thin until it finally snapped under its own weight. That patience had made him dangerous not only in the field, but across a table as well. When negotiations came or questions were asked, Martello's silence carried more pressure than most men's threats. At his core, Martello was not driven by vengeance or ambition. What drove him was something simpler and harder to explain: completion. He believed every crime created a debt that had to be settled. Every broken promise, every stolen dollar, every life taken unjustly left a weight behind that demanded balance. His role, as he saw it, was to see that balance restored before the damage spread further. The problem was that a man who believed that rarely knew when to stop. He did not make decisions based on popularity, fear, or convenience. The law, in his mind, was not meant to bend with circumstance. It was meant to hold firm when everything else tried to give way. Even those who disliked him respected that about him. They might disagree with his methods, but they always knew exactly where he stood. In a world where loyalty shifted like desert winds, that kind of consistency carried its own authority. But by the same traits that made him effective also carried their own cost. Years of violence, war, and loss had taught him to keep his distance from people. Allies rode beside him, but fewer rode close. Respect came easily. Companionship did not. The result was a kind of quiet isolation that followed him from town to town. When a man lived through that long enough, he stopped expecting anyone to stand beside him when trouble arrived. That solitude made him resilient, but also left him exposed in ways he rarely acknowledged. Once Martello began a pursuit, he found it difficult to let go. The same determination that made him relentless could become something closer to obsession. When he believed he was right, compromise felt like surrender. It was a trait that had served him well in the wilderness, where hesitation could get a man killed. But the West was changing, and the kind of problems now arising across the frontier did not always yield to the same methods that had worked before. That change was the source of Martello's quiet unease. The law he had spent his life enforcing was slowly transforming into something more distant, more procedural. Railroads carried people and goods faster than horses could track them. Courts and committees replaced the lone authority of a badge and a gun belt. Justice was becoming slower, more complicated, and increasingly removed from the men who expected to enforce it. Martello could feel the shift like pressure in the air before a storm. He did not fear dying in the line of duty. What he feared, though he would never say out loud, was surviving long enough to realize the world no longer needed men like him. The quiet tragedy of Martello's life was that he had spent decades enforcing order in a world that once required men exactly like him. But that world was fading. Railroads, banks, and distant offices were reshaping the frontier, and lone riders like him were slowly being replaced by paperwork and procedure. Martello did not fear dying in the line of duty. What he feared, though he would never say it aloud, was surviving long enough to realize the world no longer needed men like him. And yet, on the morning trouble truly began in Sawtooth County, those instincts that guided him for so long told him something was wrong. It wasn't the kind of trouble that came with guns and wanted posters. This was quieter, patient, and already moving through the town like a shadow. Coming soon, Chapter 2, The Nightshaders.